The biggest news of the year, of course, was announced on Tuesday that government's planning to buy the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. We've been talking about it pretty much ever since, and I think it's fair to say that whilst many of our listeners think it's a great move, even more think that we're paying too much for old boats and that government controls the last thing that any successful operation needs to remain profitable and efficient. We've heard lots of points of view from listeners and industry chiefs alike, but the man at the centre of the deal is with me in the studio to answer your questions. Treasury Minister Alfred Cannan, welcome, and thanks very much for offering to come in today and chat.
Well, good afternoon, Stu, and always a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, you're starting smooth. We'll get to the bottom of that. Now, I've got to ask this question before we get into the meat of this. We're always being told how important it is that honourable members are ahead of any important announcements, but most MHKs read like the rest of us about this in the newspaper on Tuesday morning, ahead even of the official announcement. I've got to give my friends at the newspapers full credit for a good scoop, but how did that happen?
Well, they did. They got a scoop, Stu. All credit to their lead reporter, who got wind of the story very early on, and there had to be a quid pro quo in terms of it was such a sensitive and delicate negotiation that in the end we had to give the newspaper the detail earlier than we wanted to, and that's just it. That's journalism for you. They got a sniff of the story, and in order for us to keep things quiet, there effectively was a deal done that they would get the details, and it's as simple as that.
Interesting. Okay. Isn't that going to cause problems with Tynwald members who didn't know anything about it?
Well, I've explained the situation to Tynwald members, and they understand. These deals are commercially sensitive, as you might imagine. There's two parties. There's always two parties to every deal, and before you begin these negotiations, people set out their terms and conditions of undertaking the negotiations, what sort of information is confidential, what information can be released, and there was a danger that anything put into the public domain the other side would have simply just walked away. Because, to be fair to them, if this doesn't go through on Tuesday, they want to be able to deal in a commercial manner with the repercussions of that, and they may want to sell the business on to another buyer. So I fully understand that, and that's the reason how that happened.
I think my opening remark on this on Tuesday, when we talked about it first on the programme, was that I've been thinking for years that the Isle of Man government ought to own the steam packet. So, in outline terms, I think I'm broadly in support of this. I think it's just the detail, though, isn't it? And I did say that, I don't fully understand the deal because, I'm not that bright at figures and things. You are. So just explain it to me and to other people who don't quite get it. It's costing us £124 million. Talking about round figures now, and that's split into 74 million quid of a loan and 50 million quid to actually buy the shareholding in the steam packet company. Why is there a split? Surely if you're buying a company, you just buy a company, don't you?
Well, we are, because it does get a little bit confusing, but you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand how we've got to the price that we have with the existing shareholders. And in order to get to that price, you've got to understand if we don't deal with them and get a new user agreement in place, their likely option is to run the business for cash through till 2026 to maximise every single penny that they can out of the business.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And you effectively, we've added all that up, what they would have taken out, and deducted a few bits and pieces, and you come to £124.3 million.
Okay, we can get to the actual sum later, but why is 74 million of it a loan? And is that to repay the debts that we've heard about?
Well, they currently have, on the day of the deal, there'll be £86 million of debt left. We will effectively pay that off, and what we're going to do is replace it with £76 million debt of our own, and the rest will be for the equity of the business. And that is our choice. That's the way we want to structure it. It's a sensible way to do things. And that's how it's going to be done. And that's how the deal will then progress further.
Let me just clarify, because my brain's glazing. It does when I talk to any accountant. It's not just you. But so you're buying a company that has debts. You're lending them the money to pay off the debts, and you're also buying the company. Is that how it works, or is there still going to be any debt after you've spent 124 million quid?
No, we spend 124 million pounds. The company is absolutely free of all its debts at that point.
Good.
Completely.
Yeah, but you're hoping to get that £74 million back.
Getting our money back effectively. So therefore, the structure that we're putting in place is that £76 million of that will now reflect as a loan to the
Yes.
business. So
Yes.
we will replace the debt on an almost like-for-like basis, and we will buy the shares for the £48 million.
Okay, and the other thing that people have talked about this week is that apparently there is a big pension liability as well at the steam packet. I mean, what size is that?
There is a pension liability, and we have clearly factored that into our cash flow forecasts on an ongoing basis, Stu. The pension fund is funded up to about £47 million at the moment. It was recognised there was an additional £5.8 million liability in the initial due diligence that the sellers provided to us. Our due diligence suggested a slightly higher figure. Bottom line is we've come to an agreement and we've factored that in. So we are aware of that issue.
You're aware of it.
And that will be an issue that any executive team would have to sort out, irrespective of which hands or ownership structure it ultimately ended up in.
Because of the public sector pension deficit in the Isle of Man generally with the civil service, people are very nervous about these big sort of bottomless pits, aren't they?
Well, they are nervous, and quite rightly so, and lots of businesses are having to deal with that, including lots of businesses in the shipping world. We're aware these are not uncommon factors or uncommon risks that you would normally not be aware of. We're fully aware of the situation.
Yeah.
This is and remains a highly profitable business. We factored in some extra pension costs into the deal and are happy with the valuation that we've currently got on the business and the ability of the business to deal with that over the next 25, 30 years.
All right, back to the numbers part of it then. So the £124 million is, again, in round figures, £74 million, which is a loan to pay off the existing debt of the company, £50 million is to buy the company. And you're saying that you want to see that £74 million back very quickly because it's a loan. Do you mean you want the steam packet to repay it, or do you mean that you want to refinance that part of it, the loan?
Yeah, so the option that we are intending to pursue, I'll just be accurate about the figure, £76 million will be the loan that we have provided effectively to the steam packet. The option that we are intending to pursue is the steam packet seeks to refinance that, in other words, to pay government back its £76 million and to refinance that debt either by means of some sort of public bond offering, in other words, the public will finance the debt and get the interest paid directly to them, or alternatively, if that's not commercially viable, then to find the best deal on a commercial basis with the banks, basically, normal lending criteria.
I think somebody suggested this week that the deal involved them paying that back within a year, which is just, that's unachievable, isn't it?
Well, no, yes, they will refinance that. They will pay government back. They will pay government back within a year. So we will put £76 million back into our reserves. The steam packet will still have that debt. They will just have that debt either to the public, either through some form of bond,
or
if that's possible, or to a bank.
It looks as though long term government wants to keep a controlling interest in it, but not necessarily be the sole shareholder. So you've just mentioned that you're going to have to look at different methods of finance on this. If you're going to sell, say 49% of the shareholding at some point, will Manx residents be given some sort of an incentive to buy shares? Maybe a limit on the maximum holding that individuals can have?
Well, that's a consideration for us to cover when we look at the options that are available to us on that side. I think the question that you asked leads right back to the whole purpose for us doing this in the first place. I and many others in government, and not only in government, out in the wider population, find it a ridiculous situation for us to be negotiating our sole monopoly strategic sea links with hedge funds, Portuguese banks, Japanese banks, and whoever else is in the whole mix of the current debt structure that is around the steam packet. If we give them a new user agreement, the first thing that is going to happen is that is all going to change again, and the next set of hedge funds, bankers, whoever else is going to get involved and find ways to put more debt probably onto the company and find ways to strip more profit out. For a monopoly strategic sea services provider, that's absolutely ridiculous. We think that should be back in providing more economic benefit to the island, having greater control over the regulatory elements, i.e. the user agreement, and more importantly, a new relationship, shareholder agreement with the effectively the board, so that we can better get economic benefit onto the Isle of Man. And the easiest way to explain that is to say relatively over the period of time, the costs, for example, that freight users would be paying will relatively, in comparison to what they would have been, will come down. And we will provide over the 25 years of the deal better economic and thus better social outcomes for the island. And that goes back to the very heart of the question that you just asked about benefits to the island as a whole.
Well, I think that's been part of the bugbear about this for many years. The fact is that the only beneficiaries of the success of the steam packet and the high prices that people perceive has been, like you say, Japanese investors or Portuguese banks or whoever. I don't think people would be as bothered about people making profits out of the steam packet if it was Manx people that were making profit out of it. So, you don't want to swap one set of investors offshore for another set, which is what makes me ask the question about whether or not you couldn't make it a purely Isle of Man resident offering at some point.
So sorry, Stu. Yes, you did ask that as part of your question. That will certainly be part of the consideration, because it's pointless doing this if the island is not benefiting further from the outlay that we're making as a national government. It would be highly plausible for us to have a local share offering of some sort to fund the £48 million. It would also be highly plausible for the company to investigate whether or not a local bond offering, and if both parts came together, then local people would definitely share in the rewards that come from the profit that comes from the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company.
One of the questions that came out repeatedly this week, people were saying, well, couldn't we just have taken over the steam packet or taken over some sort of a ferry operation at the end of the user agreement? 2024, was it?
2026.
2026.
In theory, we could have decided to buy 2 new ships, have them parked out in Douglas Harbour, and on the due date in 2026, sailed them into the relative link span. I say link span because the steam packet own the other link span in Victoria Pier. So we have the King Edward link span, which is the government's, the Victoria Pier link span, which is the steam packet. And in theory, we could have done that. That in itself would have probably cost the government at least £100 million. And of course, we would have had all the issues and negotiations of smooth transfer of operations, setting up the operations. And if the steam packet didn't play ball, if the shareholders didn't play ball, we would have put at risk significantly economic or created probable higher economic and social cost attached to that, in that they would have, their behaviour would have been to simply hoik prices as high as they could possibly get away with. That would have then reflected to the consumer on the street. Over that 6-year period, by the time the government got its ships in 2026, your phone lines would have been red hot with people screaming at the cost of living on the island. And you can see from that simple explanation why we think it is in the island's interest to act now and not engage in what effectively is a game of poker for the next 6 years with the
negotiations with the steam packet over the last few years seem to have been getting a little bit more hard-edged. There's been a suggestion that maybe government's been backed into a corner as far as having to buy the operation is concerned, because the alternatives that had been presented were just untenable.
I don't think they were untenable, but we would have increasingly, the whole situation that the government's allowed to develop had become more and more unacceptable. And it goes really back to the heart of this element and an aspect of this, is that we have our strategic sea service, our monopoly provider, controlled by Portuguese banks at the moment and various other shareholders, and who are stripping out from that company all the benefits And the Isle of Man people, the Isle of Man businesses, who are absolutely reliant on that business, who provide all the company with all its profits, have no benefit at all from that, other than, of course, the transport link itself working efficiently and effectively. And of course, that is very important. But it is a ridiculous situation for a national government to effectively have its back to the wall and trying to end up in a negotiation with this sort of structure, with international banks and hedge funds. And we need to address that situation in the greater long-term social and economic interests of the island. But at the same time, I must recognise that government does not have a fantastic track record in running commercial enterprises, and that's why we are adamant that we must then restructure this business to ensure that the government has strategic control, provides the framework that it wants to see and the benefits that it wants to see from its shipping services, but allows the board of directors and the executive management to then get on and deliver
because they've been doing a good job. I mean, they've been doing it for the wrong people, but they've been doing a good job, haven't they?
Stu, they have done a very good job, all things considered, and that's been reflected in the due diligence reports that we've had. So we've had the shipping experts in from an international maritime business who've carried out their inspection, and this was ex-mariners inspecting ships, so ferry experts looking at these ships. They've looked at them inside out, and they've looked at the operation of the company, and they've come back and reported a well-run, efficient business with ships comparatively in good shape compared to other ships of their
all right. Well,
age.
we'll talk about that in a little while, because that's one of the questions that I've put together from this week. But it's interesting that you're honest enough to say that government's not necessarily good at operating commercial things. Ewan Turner, who was up until recently in MLC, said in the paper this week, I think, that you couldn't run a cafe, much less a shipping company. So that must have stung a bit.
Well, coming from Ewan Turner, who spent 15 years in politics and achieved absolutely nothing, I'm not really going to pay a great deal of attention to what he's got to say. But I think that's completely unnecessary and to a large extent untrue. We have to balance out a number of disadvantages on the island. You've got to remember we're running a national government, and the amount of people available on the island versus the facilities that we need don't always make economic sense, and sometimes the government has to make a judgment as to what's necessary to maintain social fabric, and sometimes those things have to be supported. But this is a completely different case, and I don't really want to get sucked into comparing the Strategic Sea Service with the NSC Cafe.
Yeah, all right. We need to take a quick break. We'll come back and start taking some calls.